This marriage was never supposed to become real. That was what the people of Dry Creek kept saying the morning Ethan Caldwell signed his name beside a woman he had barely spoken to before. The paper lay flat on the mayor's desk, thin as a whisper, yet somehow heavy enough to silence the entire room. Outside the window, the Arizona sun was already burning across the dusty street, turning wagon wheels and storefront glass into pale gold. Ethan stood there in his worn boots, hat in his hands, the same quiet cowboy everyone in town knew as the man who kept to himself on a lonely ranch 3 miles past the cottonwoods. Across the desk stood Ayanna Redbird, her dark hair tied back with a simple leather cord, her expression calm in a way that seemed almost too steady for a woman about to marry a stranger. The mayor cleared his throat, dipped the pen in ink, and slid the document forward. No music played. No family gathered. The only witnesses were a few curious townsfolk and Sheriff Warren Pike leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching like the whole thing was some kind of joke. Ethan read the line that mattered twice. Husband and wife under territorial law. A simple arrangement. The lawyer had said the night before, nothing more than ink and signatures. Ayanna needed a legal husband to keep the small piece of land her father had left her near Dry Creek. Without it, the territory would take everything by the end of the month. Ethan had listened quietly, staring into the lantern light while the desert wind pushed against the windows. He was not a man known for big speeches or bold gestures. But something about the story of that land, about a daughter trying to hold on to the last place her father had called home, stayed with him longer than he expected. When the lawyer asked if he would consider helping, Ethan had only shrugged once and said he would think about it. Now the pen was in his hand. Sheriff Pike chuckled under his breath and said loud enough for half the room to hear that a cowboy marrying a native woman on paper was the strangest deal Dry Creek had seen in years. No one defended Ethan. They just waited. Ethan Caldwell looked at the paper again, then at Ayanna. She did not plead or explain. She simply stood there, steady as the desert horizon. After a moment, he lowered the pen and signed his name in slow, careful letters. The ink soaked into the page, sealing a promise that was never meant to be more than a formality. But the strange thing about that quiet morning in Dry Creek was this. Long before the sun set behind the red hills, people would start whispering that the paper marriage between Ethan Caldwell and Ayanna Redbird might not stay simple for long. The people of Dry Creek did not forget what they saw in that office, and by the time Ethan Caldwell stepped back out onto the sunburned street, the whispers had already started moving through town like desert wind through dry grass. Ethan did not answer any of them. He placed his hat back on his head and walked toward the hitching rail where his gray horse waited patiently in the heat. The animal lifted its head when he approached, breathing slow and steady as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Ethan rested his hand along the horse's neck for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun through the coat. To most people in Dry Creek, Ethan Caldwell had always been something of a mystery. He had arrived 3 years earlier with little more than a saddle, a rifle he rarely touched, and enough money to buy a small stretch of land just outside town. The ranch was nothing impressive, just a weathered cabin, a narrow corral, and a windmill that creaked whenever the afternoon breeze rolled in from the open desert. But Ethan kept the place running. He fixed his own fences, rode long miles to check water lines, and sold just enough cattle each season to keep the land alive. He spoke rarely, drank even less, and never stayed in town longer than necessary. Some said he was proud. Others believed he simply preferred silence. The truth was that Ethan Caldwell had learned a long time ago that quiet life was easier when a man did not carry more trouble than he needed. That was why the paper he had just signed made no sense to most of the town. Helping someone like Ayanna Redbird did not bring him money or land or respect from the people who gathered every evening at the Dry Creek Saloon. In fact, it likely meant the opposite. Sheriff Warren Pike stepped out of the mayor's office behind him and leaned against the wooden porch post, watching Ethan saddle his horse. The sheriff shook his head slowly and said that the whole arrangement would not last a month once the town council decided to look closer at it. Ethan did not argue. He simply tightened the saddle strap, mounted the horse in one smooth motion, and turned toward the dusty road leading out of town. Behind him, Ayanna Redbird stepped out of the office doorway into the bright Arizona sunlight. For a brief moment their eyes met across the street. They were husband and wife now according to the law, but they were still strangers standing in two different worlds. Ethan tipped the brim of his hat once, not as a greeting, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the promise he had made with a single line of ink. Then he nudged the gray horse forward and rode out past the last wooden buildings of Dry Creek toward the open land where the wind carried the smell of sagebrush and dry earth. What Ethan Caldwell did not know as he rode those 3 miles back to his ranch was that the decision he had made that morning was already beginning to change the path of both their lives in ways neither of them could yet see. The road from Dry Creek to Ethan Caldwell's ranch stretched across nearly 3 miles of open desert where the wind carried dust in long drifting lines across the earth. Ethan rode slowly that afternoon, not because the distance was long, but because the sun was high and the gray horse beneath him preferred a steady pace. The land around him was quiet except for the creaking windmill on a distant property and the soft rhythm of hooves pressing into dry ground. When he finally reached the narrow gate of his ranch, he swung down from the saddle and opened it with one hand, guiding the horse through before closing it again behind them. The cabin sat about 50 yards from the corral, a simple wooden structure with a small porch and a tin roof that shimmered under the Arizona heat. Ethan had built most of it himself during his first year there, board by board, working slowly until the place felt solid enough to call home. Inside there was little more than a table, a small iron stove, a narrow bed against the wall, and a shelf where he kept tools and a few worn books. It was not much, but it was quiet, and for Ethan Caldwell quiet had always been worth more than comfort. He unsaddled the horse and let it drink from the trough before walking toward the cabin porch. The moment he stepped inside the shade, he removed his hat and set it on the table. The room felt cooler than the desert outside, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and dry cedar. Ethan poured himself a tin cup of water and sat down, staring for a long moment at the empty chair across from him. Earlier that morning the mayor had folded the marriage paper and handed it to Ayanna Redbird. According to the law, they were now husband and wife, but nothing in Ethan's small cabin had changed. There was still only one chair by the table and only one bed against the wall. That had been the agreement after all. The lawyer had explained it clearly the night before. The marriage existed only to protect the land Ayanna's father had left her near the edge of Dry Creek. She would remain on her property, and Ethan would continue living at his ranch. It was a simple arrangement meant to stay out of sight and out of trouble. Yet as Ethan sat there listening to the distant sound of wind moving through the sagebrush, he found himself wondering whether the town would truly leave the matter alone. Sheriff Warren Pike was not a man who enjoyed being ignored, and the look in the sheriff's eyes that morning had not been friendly. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair and stared out the open door toward the long stretch of desert beyond his fence line. Somewhere out there, only a few miles away, Ayanna Redbird was likely standing on the land her father had once cared for, holding the folded document that now tied her name to his. It was meant to be nothing more than a line of ink on paper, a quiet solution to a problem the law had created. But the desert had a way of turning small decisions into long stories, and though Ethan Caldwell did not yet know it, the quiet promise he had made that morning was already beginning to reach farther than the boundaries of either of their lands. Late that afternoon, the desert wind began to rise across the open land outside Dry Creek, pushing thin trails of dust along the ground as the sun slowly drifted toward the western hills. Ethan Caldwell spent the remaining hours of daylight repairing a loose section of fence along the north side of his ranch. The work was simple and familiar, the kind that kept a man's hands busy and his thoughts quiet. He measured the distance between the posts, pulled the wire tight, and hammered the staples into place with steady patience. From where he stood, he could see nearly half a mile of open desert stretching toward the distant cottonwoods near the creek. The sky above it was wide and pale blue, the kind that made a man feel small beneath it. By the time Ethan finished the repair, the sun was lowering into a deep orange line near the horizon. He carried his tools back toward the cabin, pausing at the trough to check the water level for the gray horse before stepping onto the porch. The windmill nearby turned slowly, its metal frame creaking with each rotation. Evening in that part of Arizona always arrived quietly. The heat faded, the air cooled, and the desert seemed to breathe again after a long day under the sun. Ethan poured water into a small kettle and set it on the iron stove, then leaned one shoulder against the doorframe while he waited for it to warm. The silence around the ranch felt the same as it always had, steady and familiar. Yet something about the day felt slightly different now that his name was tied to someone else's. Ayanna Redbird was likely settling into her own small cabin a few miles away, the one her father had built years earlier on the edge of the land he once farmed. Ethan had only seen the place once from a distance while riding past the ridge road. It was a narrow piece of land, but good enough for a garden and a few animals if the wells held water through the dry months. That land was the reason the agreement existed at all. Without the marriage document, the territory could claim it by the end of the season. The lawyer had explained that the law did not care much for fairness, only for signatures and ownership. Ethan had seen enough of the world to know that part was true. The kettle began to rattle softly on the stove, and Ethan poured the hot water into a tin cup, carrying it out onto the porch where the evening wind moved gently across the open land. The sun had nearly disappeared now, leaving a long band of fading light over the desert. Ethan sat down on the wooden step and watched the horizon grow darker. For a moment, he wondered whether the town would continue talking about the decision he had made that morning or whether their attention would soon drift toward something else. Dry Creek was a small place, but even small places eventually found new stories to chase. What Ethan Caldwell could not see from his porch that evening was a single lantern glowing in the window of a cabin several miles away, where Ayanna Redbird unfolded the marriage document again and read the same line of ink beneath his name, quietly realizing that the stranger who had signed it might soon become far more important in her life than either of them had expected. Morning arrived slowly across the desert outside Dry Creek, the pale light of the rising sun spreading over the open land like a quiet promise of another long day. Ethan Caldwell was already awake before the first rays reached the porch of his cabin. He moved through the morning routine the same way he always did, lighting the small iron stove, pouring water into the kettle, and stepping outside to check the corral while the air was still cool. The gray horse lifted its head when Ethan approached, nudging the wooden rail softly, as if expecting grain. Ethan filled the trough, brushed dust from the saddle blanket, and glanced toward the wide horizon where the land rolled gently toward the distant hills. Nothing looked different from the day before, yet the memory of the paper he had signed still sat quietly in the back of his mind. 3 miles away, Ayanna Redbird stood beside the narrow well on the land her father had once cared for. The early morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and dry soil as she lowered the bucket into the water and pulled it back up with steady hands. The small cabin behind her was older than Ethan's, its wooden boards faded by years of desert sun, but it stood firmly against the wind the way her father had always intended. Ayanna placed the bucket beside the garden patch where a few stubborn plants had survived the long dry season. The land was not large, barely enough for a few rows of vegetables and a small pen for animals, but it was the only place that still carried the memory of her family. When the lawyer had explained the new territorial rules 2 weeks earlier, the future of that land had seemed uncertain. Ayanna had listened quietly as he spoke about ownership and documents and the need for a legal husband under the law. She had expected the conversation to end there. Instead, the name Ethan Caldwell had entered the story in a way she had not predicted. She had seen him around Dry Creek before, usually riding through town without stopping long enough to join the conversations outside the general store. He had always seemed like a man who preferred distance over attention. Yet the day she asked for help, he had listened without interrupting and then agreed with only a few calm words. That decision had given her the chance to stand there that morning beside her father's well, watching the sun climb slowly over the desert hills. Ayanna reached into the pocket of her dress and unfolded the document once more. The paper was already beginning to crease along the edges, but the ink on it remained clear and steady. Ethan Caldwell's name rested beside her own in careful letters. According to the law, they now shared a bond stronger than most people in Dry Creek believed it deserved. Ayanna folded the document again and looked across the quiet land around her. The future of that small property had been protected for now, but the reaction of the town was another matter entirely. Even in the calm morning air, she could still hear the echo of Sheriff Warren Pike's voice from the day before, filled with doubt and quiet warning. What neither Ethan nor Ayanna knew yet was that the agreement meant to protect a piece of land would soon place both of them directly in the path of a town that did not easily accept changes to the rules it had lived by for years. By midday the sun hung high above Dry Creek, pouring heat across the wooden roofs and dusty streets, while the town slowly gathered into its usual rhythm. Wagons creaked past the general store, the blacksmith's hammer rang against iron, and a few men stood beneath the shade of the saloon porch talking quietly about the story that had begun spreading the previous morning. In a town as small as Dry Creek, unusual news did not stay quiet for long. A cowboy marrying a native woman on paper was the kind of story that people repeated again and again, each time adding their own opinion about what it meant. Sheriff Warren Pike listened to most of those conversations without saying much, but his silence did not mean approval. He stood outside the sheriff's office with his hat pushed back slightly, watching the slow movement of the street as if waiting for something to settle into place. Pike had lived in Dry Creek longer than most people could remember. He believed the town worked best when everyone understood the rules that had shaped it. To him, the arrangement between Ethan Caldwell and Ayanna Redbird felt like a small crack in those rules, the kind that could widen if no one paid attention. Inside the general store, a clerk finished writing a receipt, while two ranchers leaned against the counter discussing the situation in low voices. One of them said the marriage was probably nothing more than a temporary trick to satisfy the law. The other replied that even a trick could cause trouble if it encouraged others to challenge the way things had always been done. Out beyond the edge of town, Ethan Caldwell continued his work without knowing exactly how large the conversation had become. He rode the fence line that afternoon, checking the posts along the southern stretch of his land where the wind sometimes loosened the wire. The gray horse moved steadily beneath him, hooves pressing soft patterns into the dry ground, while the open desert stretched quiet and wide in every direction. Ethan preferred days like that, when the only sounds were the breeze through the grass and the distant turning of the windmill near his cabin. The work demanded attention, but not conversation. It allowed a man to think clearly if he wished, or to think about nothing at all. Yet as he guided the horse along the fence, the memory of the mayor's office returned briefly to his mind. The ink on that paper had connected his life to Ayanna Redbird in a way that no one in Dry Creek seemed ready to ignore. Miles away, Ayanna finished tending the small garden beside her cabin, unaware that the town council would soon begin discussing the legality of the document she now carried. For the moment, the land around her remained calm and open beneath the wide sky, but the quiet would not last forever. The decision made in a small office had begun to travel through Dry Creek like a slow rising wind, and before many days passed, both Ethan Caldwell and Ayanna Redbird would discover that a simple promise written in ink could stir far more attention than either of them had expected. 2 days passed after the conversation began spreading through Dry Creek, and the desert settled into the quiet rhythm of early autumn. The mornings arrived cooler now, with pale sunlight stretching slowly across the open land while the wind carried a faint scent of dry grass and distant rain that never quite reached the valley. Ethan Caldwell began that morning the same way he had begun most mornings for years. He stepped out onto the porch of his cabin just as the first light touched the top of the windmill, the metal blades turning slowly against the sky. The gray horse stood near the trough, ears flicking at the sound of his boots on the wooden boards. Ethan filled a bucket with fresh water and poured grain into the feed box, moving through the work without hurry. Life on a ranch taught a man patience. Fences needed checking, wells needed watching, and the desert never cared how quickly someone finished a chore. Yet as Ethan walked along the fence line that morning, he noticed something unusual. A set of wagon tracks had cut across the distant ridge road sometime during the night. The tracks were not headed toward town. They led in the opposite direction, toward the narrow stretch of land where Ayanna Redbird lived. Ethan paused beside a fence post and studied the marks for a moment. Wagons passed through the desert often enough, but the direction made him wonder who would be traveling toward that part of the valley so early. 3 miles away, Ayanna had already finished drawing water from the well beside her cabin. The bucket rested on the ground while she watered the small rows of vegetables her father had planted long before the land became uncertain. The plants were beginning to grow stronger now that cooler air had arrived, their green leaves standing out against the pale brown soil. Ayanna moved slowly along the rows, careful not to waste a drop of water in the dry ground. For a short time the land felt peaceful again, just as it had when her father was still there to walk the garden paths in the evening light. But the quiet did not last long. As the sun climbed higher, the distant sound of wheels rolling over stone reached the edge of her property. Ayana looked toward the ridge and saw a small wagon moving down the narrow trail that led toward her cabin. Two men sat on the front bench, their shapes dark against the bright desert sky. The wagon stopped near the fence line, and one of the men stepped down slowly, brushing dust from his coat. Even from a distance, Ayana recognized the wide hat and straight posture of Sheriff Warren Pike. He stood beside the wagon for a moment, looking across the land as though measuring it in his mind. Then he began walking toward the cabin with calm, deliberate steps. Back at his ranch, Ethan Caldwell turned his gray horse toward the same ridge road, unaware that the quiet agreement he had signed only days earlier was about to be questioned in a way neither he nor Ayana had fully prepared for. The wagon stopped just beyond the narrow wooden fence that marked the edge of Ayana Redbird's land, its wheels settling into the pale dust as the desert wind moved quietly across the valley. Sheriff Warren Pike removed his hat for a moment and looked over the small property with slow, careful attention. The garden rows were neat and green despite the dry soil. The well bucket rested beside the post, and the narrow cabin stood steady beneath the wide Arizona sky. It was not a large piece of land, but it was clearly cared for. Ayana stood near the well, her hands still resting on the rope she had used to pull water from the ground. She watched the sheriff approach without speaking, her posture calm but alert as the sound of his boots moved closer across the dirt. Pike stopped several feet away and replaced his hat, studying her expression as though he expected to see fear or hesitation. Instead, he found neither. The sheriff cleared his throat and spoke in a steady voice, explaining that the town council had begun asking questions about the document signed in the mayor's office only days earlier. According to Pike, the council believed the arrangement might be nothing more than a clever way to bend the law, and Dry Creek did not appreciate its rules being tested. Ayana listened quietly, the desert breeze moving lightly through the cottonwood leaves near the fence line. When the sheriff finished speaking, she reached into the pocket of her dress and unfolded the paper he had come to discuss. The document was still clean despite the dust of the land around her, the ink lines dark and careful beneath the bright sunlight. She held it out so the sheriff could see the signatures clearly. Pike glanced at the page and nodded once, acknowledging that the document itself appeared legitimate. Still, he explained that many people in town believed the agreement was not genuine because the two names on the paper belonged to individuals who did not even live under the same roof. Ayana lowered the document slowly and folded it again with careful hands. She told the sheriff that the law had asked for a husband and a signature, and those two things had been given exactly as required. The sheriff studied her for a long moment before turning his eyes toward the distant ridge road where the desert stretched open for miles. What neither of them noticed at first was the faint sound of hoofbeats approaching from beyond that ridge. Ethan Caldwell had followed the wagon tracks he had seen earlier that morning, guiding his gray horse across the rolling desert land until the small cabin and the sheriff's wagon came into view below. He slowed the horse near the top of the ridge and watched the scene quietly from a distance. The wind carried pieces of their conversation across the open ground, just enough for Ethan to understand why Sheriff Pike had come. From where he sat in the saddle, the situation looked simple. A promise had been made and a signature had been given. Yet as Ethan Caldwell began guiding the gray horse down the slope toward the cabin, he could already sense that the quiet agreement between him and Ayana Redbird was about to face its first real test. The sound of Ethan Caldwell's horse moving down the ridge reached the cabin slowly, carried by the same desert wind that stirred the cottonwood leaves near the fence. Sheriff Warren Pike turned first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized the rider approaching across the open land. Ethan guided the gray horse to a stop near the well and stepped down from the saddle with the same calm movement he used on his own ranch. Dust settled quietly around his boots as he rested one hand on the saddle horn for a moment and looked from the sheriff to Ayana Redbird. The silence between them stretched across the yard like a long shadow in the afternoon sun. Pike spoke first, explaining in a steady voice that the town council had begun questioning the legality of the arrangement that connected their names. According to the sheriff, several ranchers believed the marriage existed only to satisfy a rule on paper and that Dry Creek had no interest in watching its laws turned into convenient loopholes. Ethan listened without interrupting. The desert wind moved lightly through the dry grass, while the gray horse lowered its head to drink from the trough beside the fence. When Pike finished speaking, Ethan finally answered in the quiet tone that most people in Dry Creek recognized. He said the agreement had been made in the mayor's office with witnesses present and that the law had accepted it at the time. Nothing in that document had been hidden. Pike folded his arms and studied him carefully. The sheriff replied that a document might carry ink and signatures, but the council believed a real marriage meant more than a line written across a page. Ayanna stood beside the well, watching the exchange without stepping forward. Her hands rested lightly against the folded paper she still carried, the edges of it pressed neatly between her fingers. Ethan turned slightly toward her and then back toward the sheriff. He said that the law had asked for a husband and a signature, and both had been given honestly. The sheriff considered that answer for several seconds before glancing across the land again. He admitted that the council would meet in 2 days to decide whether the arrangement truly followed the spirit of the territorial rules. If the council believed it did not, they might attempt to challenge the ownership of the land again. The words settled over the small property with the weight of an approaching storm. Ethan nodded once, showing neither surprise nor anger, only a quiet understanding that the conversation was far from finished. Pike stepped back toward his wagon and climbed onto the front bench beside the other man who had waited there in silence. Before the horses began moving again, the sheriff looked back toward the cabin and said that the council would expect Ethan Caldwell to appear at the meeting as the husband named in the document. Then the wagon rolled slowly away from the fence line, its wheels carving thin tracks through the desert dust. Ethan remained standing near the well long after the wagon disappeared beyond the ridge. The wind carried the faint sound of the wheels until it faded completely, leaving only the quiet land and the uncertain question of what would happen when the people of Dry Creek gathered to decide whether a promise written in ink truly meant what it claimed. The wagon tracks slowly disappeared into the distance, leaving the land around Ayanna Redbird's cabin quiet again beneath the wide Arizona sky. For several moments neither Ethan Caldwell nor Ayanna spoke. The desert wind moved softly through the cottonwood branches, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush across the yard. Ethan finally stepped closer to the well, resting one hand against the wooden post while he looked across the small stretch of land that meant so much to her. From where he stood he could see the neat rows of vegetables, the worn path leading to the cabin door, and the low fence that marked the boundary her father had once protected. It was not large land by ranch standards, but it carried a kind of care that only came from years of quiet work. Ayanna folded the marriage document once more and slipped it carefully back into her pocket. She thanked Ethan in a calm voice for coming down from the ridge when he saw the sheriff's wagon. Ethan answered simply that the wagon tracks had pointed in this direction and that he preferred to understand what was happening rather than guess about it later. The two of them stood side by side for a moment, looking across the same open ground. The situation the sheriff had described now felt more real than it had before. In 2 days the town council would gather in the meeting hall in Dry Creek, and the decision they made there could determine whether the land beneath their feet remained in Ayanna's hands or became something the town believed it had the right to question. Ethan turned slightly toward her and said that he would attend the meeting just as the sheriff had asked. His voice carried no hesitation. A promise had been made, and Ethan Caldwell was not the kind of man who stepped away from a promise once it had been given. Ayanna studied him quietly, noticing again the calm way he spoke, the same calm she had seen when he signed the document days earlier. She told him that the council might try to argue that their marriage was not real because they lived separately. Ethan looked toward the distant hills and nodded once as though he had already considered that possibility. He replied that the law had never required them to prove affection or closeness, only the existence of a legal bond. Yet even as he spoke the words, both of them understood that Dry Creek was not always guided only by the written rules. Towns had their own ways of deciding what they believed was right. The afternoon sun began lowering toward the western horizon, casting long golden light across the garden and the fence line. Ethan walked back toward his horse and placed a steady hand on the saddle before turning once more toward Ayanna. He said that whatever the council decided to discuss, he would stand by the document they had signed. Ayanna watched him mount the gray horse and guide it slowly toward the ridge road. As he rode away, the wind carried dust behind him in a soft trail across the desert. 2 days remained before the meeting in Dry Creek, and somewhere between the quiet ranch beyond the hills and the small cabin beside the well, a simple agreement written in ink was beginning to feel less like a temporary solution and more like the beginning of a decision that would shape both of their lives. The desert evening settled slowly across the land between Dry Creek and the small cabin beside the well, and with it came the quiet understanding that the next 2 days would not pass as peacefully as the last. Ethan Caldwell rode back to his ranch beneath a sky turning soft shades of amber and violet, the gray horse moving steadily along the ridge road while the wind brushed gently across the open hills. When he reached the gate of his property, he dismounted, led the horse into the corral, and paused for a moment beside the trough while the animal drank. The windmill creaked softly above him, turning in slow circles against the fading light. Ethan stepped onto the porch of his cabin and rested his hat on the small wooden table inside. Yet his thoughts did not settle the way they usually did at the end of a long day. The words Sheriff Warren Pike had spoken still echoed quietly in his mind. The town council would meet soon, and the people of Dry Creek would decide whether the promise he had made beside Ayanna Redbird carried the same weight for them that it did for the law. Miles away, Ayanna lit a lantern inside her cabin as the last sunlight slipped behind the distant hills. The small room glowed with a warm amber light that touched the wooden walls her father had built years earlier. She placed the folded marriage document on the table and sat beside it, listening to the steady hum of insects outside and the quiet movement of the wind through the grass. For most of her life, the land around that cabin had felt safe because it carried the memory of family. Now the same land felt uncertain in a way she had never known before. The council in Dry Creek would decide whether the document protecting that land truly mattered. She remembered the calm way Ethan Caldwell had spoken earlier that afternoon, the simple certainty in his voice when he said he would stand by the promise they had made. That quiet certainty had surprised her. Most men in Dry Creek preferred to avoid trouble with the town council, yet Ethan had not hesitated. As the lantern light flickered gently across the room, Ayanna folded the document again and placed it carefully back into her pocket. Outside, the desert sky darkened into deep blue while the first stars began to appear above the valley. Back at his ranch, Ethan stepped onto the porch and looked across the wide land stretching beyond his fences. Somewhere beyond those distant ridges stood the cabin where Ayanna Redbird waited for the same uncertain meeting that now stood ahead of them both. The wind carried a faint chill across the open desert, and Ethan understood that when the council gathered in Dry Creek, the question would not simply be about a piece of paper. It would be about whether a promise between 2 strangers could become something strong enough to stand against the expectations of an entire town. The morning of the council meeting arrived with a pale gray sky over Dry Creek, the kind that made the wooden buildings of the town look quieter than usual. Wagons lined the dusty street earlier than normal, and small groups of townspeople gathered outside the meeting hall long before the doors opened. Word had spread quickly during the past 2 days, and nearly everyone in Dry Creek wanted to hear how the council would judge the unusual agreement between Ethan Caldwell and Ayanna Redbird. Ethan rode into town shortly after sunrise, the gray horse moving at a calm pace down the main street, while several curious eyes followed him from the boardwalk. He tied the horse to the rail beside the meeting hall and stepped onto the wooden porch with the same steady composure he carried on his ranch. Inside the hall, the council members were already seated behind a long table, their papers arranged carefully beneath the morning light that filtered through the windows. Sheriff Warren Pike stood near the wall, arms folded, watching as the room slowly filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, and curious neighbors who had come to witness the decision. A few minutes later, Ayanna Redbird entered quietly through the same door, her posture straight as she walked to the front of the room. The murmurs that followed her arrival were softer than the ones that had filled the street earlier, yet they carried the weight of a town still uncertain about what they believed was right. When the meeting began, the council leader explained that their concern was not simply the presence of a document, but the intention behind it. Several members questioned whether the marriage existed only to satisfy the wording of the law rather than the spirit of it. Ethan listened to every word without interruption, standing beside Ayanna with his hat resting lightly in his hands. When the council finally asked him to speak, he raised his head and answered in the same quiet tone that had always defined him. He said that when Ayanna Redbird asked for help protecting the land her father had left behind, he had agreed because it was the honest thing to do. He told them the paper carried his name because he had given his word, and his word was not something he intended to take back simply because the situation had become uncomfortable for others. The room fell silent as those words settled across the hall. The council members exchanged glances with one another, aware that the decision before them was no longer only about the letter of the law. It had become a question about whether a promise made openly and without deception deserved to stand. Outside, the wind moved gently through the streets of Dry Creek while the gray horse waited patiently at the hitching rail. Inside the hall, the council began their quiet discussion, knowing that whatever answer they reached would shape not only the future of the small piece of land beyond the ridge, but also the way the town understood honor when it appeared in a form they had not expected. The council room remained quiet for several long moments after Ethan Caldwell finished speaking, the kind of silence that settles when people realize a decision matters more than they first believed. Sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor through the tall windows, touching the boots of ranchers standing along the walls and the long table where the council members sat studying the paper before them. The document itself looked ordinary, just a sheet with 2 careful signatures, yet everyone in the room understood that it carried the future of a small piece of land beyond the ridge. The council leader finally leaned forward and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He said the law of the territory had been written clearly, and the document signed in the mayor's office followed that law exactly as it was written. Whether the marriage had begun as a practical arrangement or not, the agreement had been made openly and honestly. Because of that, the council would recognize the document as valid and the land would remain in the hands of Ayanna Redbird. A quiet murmur moved through the room as the decision settled into place. Some people nodded with approval, while others simply folded their arms and accepted the outcome without further argument. Sheriff Warren Pike stood near the wall, watching the reaction of the crowd. After a moment, he gave a slow nod of his own, as if acknowledging that the matter had been resolved in the only fair way possible. Ethan Caldwell did not celebrate or raise his voice. He simply placed his hat back on his head and thanked the council for hearing the truth of the situation. Beside him, Ayanna Redbird stood calmly, the same steady expression on her face that she had carried since the meeting began. Outside the hall, the morning wind had grown warmer, carrying the smell of dust and sunlit wood through the streets of Dry Creek. Ethan stepped onto the porch and untied the gray horse from the rail, while the small crowd slowly drifted back toward their daily routines. Ayanna followed him outside, the folded document resting safely in her pocket once again. For a moment, they stood beside the horse looking down the long road that led out of town toward the desert hills. The land beyond that ridge would remain hers now, protected not only by a line of ink, but by a promise that had been tested in front of the entire town. Ethan adjusted the saddle strap and glanced toward her before guiding the horse toward the road. The future ahead of them was still uncertain, but the distance between their 2 worlds felt smaller than it had only days before. As they rode out of Dry Creek together, the town behind them slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, while the desert stretched wide and open under the bright Arizona sky, carrying with it the quiet understanding that sometimes the simplest promise can grow into something far stronger than anyone ever expected.